And here to introduce our guest speaker from Copenhagen is Ivar Schacke. Ivar?
Thank you, and very welcome to everyone. The speaker today is Iben Schacke. Actually, my daughter, she is right now sitting in her office in the Danish Parliament, where she is going to deliver her presentation. Iben has a thorough education in political science from University of Copenhagen. Studied also in United States for a year, in France for a year, and so has a very broad background and is all the time out of Copenhagen to various meetings, primarily, of course, in Brussels, but also all the other member countries that where she has good friends. She's actually the secretary for what we call the European Committee of the Parliament. And since something like about 70% of all laws in Denmark origins in Brussels from the Commission, that means that this committee is a very, very busy committee of which she is the secretary. And how she manages that, plus a husband and 4 children, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, she manages. I think I myself look forward for her presentation, and I will just let her speak for herself. Welcome, Iben.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. I hope you can hear me all the way from across the pond. Not much fireworks in Copenhagen. We are under Corona restriction here as well. Everything closes at 10 o'clock at night, and you have, of course, to wear a mask whenever you go out in public or go on public transportation. I have been asked today to talk about the future of the transatlantic relations, a very important relationship. I'm going to try to give you more of a European perspective on that relationship, because I think most of you are more familiar with American politics and domestic politics than I am. Okay, there was a chat function showing up on my screen as well. I cannot see the chat function right now, but if you have questions.
Yes, don't worry. At the end, we'll do the questions. I'm just reminding everyone. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So today I will be comparing the European Union with the United States. That's not really easy because the United States is, of course, a state, and the European Union is actually an international organization. But please bear with me. The EU is a conglomerate of nation states and of course does not always speak with one voice, but I'm going to try to pretend in this presentation that it is more or less one unit. So please bear with me if it becomes a little bit too simplistic. The EU-US relationship is one that is based on common values and shared interests, but it's also sometimes been very complicated and riddled with disagreement. And the question for our talk today is this relationship gonna prevail also in the coming years? It has been somewhat challenged the past, I would say, maybe decade. But before we turn to the present time, and before we begin the analysis, I would like to go back in history a little bit and look at the origin of this relationship between the United States and the European Union. Thank you for the first slide. So the origins of the European Union, it really is after World War II. You had the beginning of the Cold War. You have the United States looking for allies because right after the Cold War, right when the Cold War begins, of course, the US is trying to disseminate its democratic values by building a lot of international organizations, amongst those also what becomes the European Union. The European Union is built on the very practical idea that if you cooperate and do a lot of business together, you do not want to go into war together. And what we know today as the European Union comes out of the Treaty of Rome back from 1957. The division of labor is very clear in the beginning of the relationship. the United States takes care of the security in Europe, while the European Union builds a relationship or ties the European nations together through common trade. Next slide, please. So the Cold War ends back in 1990 or 91 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden you have a United States that is really the strongest, politically strongest, economically strongest, military strongest power in the world. NATO still exists, but the common enemy that NATO was supposed to protect Western Europe from, it has disappeared. After the Berlin Wall comes down, you see a development in the European Union where more and more members, first the neutral members, Sweden, Austria, and so on, becomes member of the European Union, and then Central and Eastern European countries that used to be under the Soviet cloud comes into the European Union. So you see an expansion. Inside the European Union, you also see nation states cooperating on more and more issues. And most of all, they cooperate in trade. And out of that comes a sort of a more established relationship with the United States, where you have trade as sort of the main issue on which these two, on one side organization, on the other side a state, have agreements but also disagreements about how to conduct trade in a post-Cold War world. The United States, through the 90s, during the Clinton administrations, are pushing the European countries to take more responsibility in their neighborhood. They try to have the European states take more responsibility in the Balkans, but what we end up with in the middle of the 90s is a Dayton Agreement, and really the Americans basically settling the peace in the Balkan Wars in the beginning of the 90s. So in the 90s, the Europeans are not really willing to take on defense or a military responsibility yet for their neighborhood. So they are still very much dependent on the United States for security. Next slide, please. Before we turn to the present relationship, I just want to give you a small overview of some of the issues that the European Union is facing at the moment. The European Union has had 10 years of slow economic growth. The European economy is not growing as fast as the American and are basically trailing behind. Our near abroad here in Europe is becoming more and more unstable over the past years, and it's particularly the relationship with Russia has deteriorated. Migration is very high on the agenda in most EU member states, and Europe has experienced a lot of migration these past 10 years, and the European societies are not very good at welcoming these migrants. The new member states in Central and Eastern Europe are not mature democracies, and we have seen more and more problems with particularly Hungary and Poland that do not view rule of law in the same way that the old member states do. Brexit, we have seen the United Kingdom leave the European Union beginning of this year. It has left a political and economic hole, so to speak, in the European Union, but it has also solidified the role of Germany and France as the leading powers within the European Union. So sort of the balance of power within the EU has changed, and the EU has really become more German, I would say, the past couple of years. In the EU, the climate crisis, I think, might takes up more room in the political discussion than it does in the United States, and it has been very important for the EU to push this agenda both internally but also globally. On foreign policy, the situation is different. here there's no really common foreign policy. We still have 27 EU member states that have sometimes very different positions on global foreign policy issues. Where the EU does make a difference is within trade, because here the European Commission actually has the power to speak on behalf of all 27 member states. So what we are facing is more and more issues like environmental standards, labor standards, social standards being put into the trade agreements that the EU makes with countries or regions around the world. So that was a little status of what the EU looks today, maybe because you're not as familiar with the internal challenges of the EU as you are with the challenges that you see in the country that you probably know better than the United States. So now I'm gonna, next slide please, we're gonna turn to the EU and the current US administration to look at what the relationship, the transatlantic relations look like today. I would say that the EU views the current US administration at the moment is a little bit unpredictable and somewhat unreliable. The fact that it's unpredictable makes it hard for the EU to cooperate with the current administration, because the EU itself is very slow in decision making and very predictable. So there's a sort of a unbalance there, because the US can take very fast decisions if it wants to, and for the EU they work a little bit slower. But if you go back and look at it, the US-EU relationship started to hit bumps long before the current administration, so it's not particularly tied to this current administration, and that is also illustrated by the cartoon that you see on your screen, because that illustrates former President Bush, that already after 9/11, and 9/11 really marks a turning point, begins to move away from international organizations and multilateralism, and begins to feel that these international organizations no longer serve the US as well as they did in the past. The US view international organization as difficult and cumbersome, and sometimes also standing directly in the way of the US national interest. The current administration has probably challenged this relationship further, and particularly I think because the close contacts that used to be on a little bit lower level is not as close as it used to be. It took a long time for the current administration to fill out all the posts in its administration. So for a long time, Europeans didn't really know who to contact, and it's still almost 4 years into the presidency, almost by the end of this presidency, there's still some posts that are not filled in the way it used to be. There's a disappointment on behalf of the side of the EU, because they see multilateralism and international organization as a much more positive thing. So there's a disappointment in the lack of the US support for this. Also because if you have a common rule book globally within certain areas, it becomes much easier for an international organization like the EU to operate. Also, on the sense of shared values and shared interest, I think there's doubt on both the EU side and the US side that we see eye to eye on global issues, and that is why, and I will try to turn to some individual cases to look at more specifically where is it that the EU and the US disagrees today. Next slide. Quite obviously NATO, and here for a long time the US, and I think the illustration on also shows why the US is very interested in this, feel that the Europeans are not contributing to their own security. the US contributes a lot more, and this current administration has focused very in a very direct manner on the goal of using 2% of your GDP on defense. Very few European countries do that today. Very few. Only countries like Estonia, Greece, and the United Kingdom do that today. Thus far, NATO in Europe has been seen as the primary security umbrella, and what happens in the EU is only complementary to what happens in NATO. But the focus by the US of having this fair share, that the European countries should pay their fair share, has outraged a number of member states. And when the president, now is it a while ago, but he basically questioned Article 5, which is the main article within NATO, and that's the Musketeer oath that an attack on one NATO member state is an attack on all member states. When he put that into doubt, it started moving something within the EU. And you had countries like France, to a lesser degree Germany, talking about building a European defense independently of NATO, because we Europeans started to doubt whether NATO, and behind of course NATO, the United States, would aid European states if something was going to happen, for instance, a threat from the east. Furthermore, you've seen the current administration move its troops around Europe. There's still quite a number of troops in Europe, most of them stationed in Germany. And a few weeks ago, the German government learned through the Wall Street Journal that the US was planning to move quite a few troops from Germany and into Poland. The German government was very upset to learn this through the press and not being contacted in advance. And that's just an illustration of some of the things that are happening in the relationship right now, that things don't necessarily go through diplomatic contacts, but through Twitter or through the news media. And that's it makes it a little bit unstable, because Europeans still work in the old-fashioned way through diplomatic channels. Of course, the US still does this. This is not black and white, but there are some things that seem to happen through media announcements rather than through the sort of more established channels. Next slide, please. On US and EU are still each other's biggest trading partners. There has been, for the past couple of years, a very big focus on behalf of the US on the trade deficit that the US has with the EU in goods, the trade in goods. And particularly the German car industry has been in the focus of this. There's a sense that, or at least the president has expressed, that the Europeans are cheating the US because of this trade deficit. The European response is the slide you see on your right, and they say if you look at trade in goods, trade in services, and the income that the US gets from investments in Europe, the trade balance is different, and there's actually a surplus for the United States in the relationship. And that's the argument that the EU makes when shown the slide on the left with the trade deficit in goods. Next slide, please. The US and the EU have a number of trade issues, and that's also what you see both on your left and your right in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The EU has recently lost a case in the WTO regarding the airplane industry, Airbus, the European Airbus. And but there are several more cases pending within the WTO, and both regions still use it, but you can say that recently the US has grown more and more dissatisfied with the WTO, not really because of the European Union, but because of China. The US sees China as skirting WTO rules because of its behavior. It's state-owned enterprises, so they're state-subsidized. It's dumping of products on the world market, and it's stealing of intellectual property. So the WTO, in the view of the United States, is not functioning properly. So both the EU and the US recognize this, and they both want to reform the WTO, but the approach that they take is very different at the moment. The US administration threatens to leave the organization and has, in order to push for reforms, refused to appoint judges in the dispute settlement mechanism that you have in the WTO, while the EU approach might, you can say, has been a little bit more subtle, trying to get Canada, India, all kinds of other countries on board for more WTO reform to stop the behavior of China that is seen as unfair, not only by the United States, but also by other WTO member states. Next slide, please. The Paris Climate Agreement. I told you earlier that the EU has been pushing for this for a year. The EU saw it as a victory that this was signed in Paris, and that it basically, you had almost all countries in the world on board in this agreement. So there was a huge disappointment in Europe when the US announced that it would withdraw from the agreement because it was not in the national interest of the United States. Also because it means, of course, that countries like Russia and others can do the same, not sign up to this agreement. The EU is still working on trying to get more countries on board, and actually on climate, the EU is working close together with China, because China has a much more positive view on this, on trying to get to a point where they can produce more clean energy. That we're still far from it because they have a lot of coal in China, but they're working in that direction and within the Paris Climate Agreement framework. Next slide, please. Digital service and the digital economy is also an area where the EU and the US don't really see eye to eye. The digital economy has grown tremendously these past 20 years. At the moment, as you see on the left, the largest tech companies in the world, a lot of them are based in the US. The US approach to the digital economy has been, okay, digital tech companies are the same as ordinary companies, and we will treat them the same way also when it comes to competition legislation. The EU approach to the digital economy is different. There has been a lot more focus on digital rights of the individuals. We have passed 2 years ago or 3 years ago a general data protection regulation that basically gives citizens right to their own data. This is a problem because the business model that a lot of tech companies are based on, like Facebook and others, is of course based on the fact that you can sell information about the users on your platform. And if EU legislation limits that, that means that you're limiting the way that these companies can work in Europe. Also, there's a general sense in Europe, and now we're moving a little bit to the right picture, that American, or rather tech companies in general, make their money on data generated in Europe, and that these companies should therefore contribute more to taxes paid in Europe. They pay very, very little taxes, next to nothing. But I think that's also the case in the US. I think a lot of these companies have good lawyers that set up tax schemes, because of course there's no general global agreements on how to tax companies, and they and in the EU there's talk of now agreeing to a digital tax to have these companies contribute more to basically the states in Europe. That, of course, is not very popular in DC, and that's another issue where the EU and the US disagrees. Finally, also on the left, you see that the European Commission is trying to test whether Apple, and that's why there's an apple on the right, and some of the other big tech companies are in violation of EU competition rules. It's actually not going so well because the EU lost the first round in their own European Court of Justice, but they have appealed the court's decision. And if they win that case, it means that a lot of the tax schemes in Europe would have to be changed. Next slide, please. The current crisis, I would just use as an illustration of the different approach at the moment to global issues. And of course, COVID-19 is a good illustration because it's a pandemic. The US, as you all know, has announced that it might withdraw from the WTO, which has been seemed too soft on China. While the EU has taken a very different approach, the EU has decided to send more money to the WHO to help find a coordinated response to this crisis, a globally coordinated response. One part of that response is, of course, the vaccines. Both the US and the EU have sought to buy parts in all the companies that are trying to produce a vaccine at the moment. So they have sort of invested in these companies. But other than that, the EU has also, together with nations like Canada, Japan, and Norway, and so forth, promised that they would distribute vaccines to the development world when the vaccine comes. And the US has chosen not to participate in this initiative, basically because it is partly going through the WHO that they disagree with. Next slide, please. The next slides will be about China and Russia, because it turns out, if you look at the basic interests, the EU and the US have a lot in common when it comes to both China and Russia, but I think that their approach to the two is slightly different. If you look at the top figure, you will see that China is now, these days, the largest economy in the world. It's still growing. It will be the only economy, as far as I know, that will grow this year, while the rest of the economies will be, at least in Europe, we will see a slight contraction in our economy, and in the US you will only see a small growth. So China is booming, and the economies in the US and the EU to a slighter extent. The approach to China is, the worries about China is basically the same on both sides of the Atlantic. There's worries about Chinese investments in infrastructure. There's worries about Chinese digital surveillance. There's worries about unfair competition. I touched on that before, because the Chinese economy, to a large extent, also operate with state-subsidized companies. But while China for EU is a strategic partner and a systemic rival, the US sees China more as a great power competition game, and they are not as interested in trying to figure out a common rule book, and that's what the cartoon at the bottom shows. They're not as interested in finding a common rule book which all can play by as the EU is. The EU is much more into looking at international organizations, seeing how you can get China to play by the rules in these, while the United States is of the opinion that these institutions will never be strong enough to really enforce that China plays by the rules. So there's a very different conception, a very different approach to how you deal, so to speak, with China. Next slide, please. The approach to Russia there's also worries that Russia is going in the wrong direction, but because of the physical closeness to the European Union, the relationship between the EU and Russia and the US and Russia is quite different. The US has handled Russia the past couple of years with sanctions and with kicking home diplomats and sort of very clearly showing Russia that they're unhappy with their behavior. The EU has had a more careful approach. One of the reasons why is that EU is very reliant on gas, on natural gas from Russia. So it's not so smart, and that's what the top drawing shows, is how much each member state is reliant on gas. And you see particularly Germany is very reliant on the natural gas, that it because it is closing down its nuclear plants, it becomes more reliant on gas, and it hasn't got enough renewables yet to be independent of Russia. The US and the EU agrees, of course, on Crimea. The US and the EU agrees that Russia is a cyber threat. You all know that Russia got mixed up in the last presidential election in the United States. The Russia was also very involved in the European elections a couple of years ago, where they also tried to spread disinformation, and they are very active in some member states, not in the smaller one, but they are active. They tried to be active in the last French presidential election, but for some reasons they fared pretty poorly. But in the European elections, they were quite. They unfortunately were quite good at getting disinformation spread out through Europe. So it's a problem, but the approach again is different. The US is much more blatantly showing the rest of the world what they think of Russia. I know the president has had a little bit of a different approach to Russia, but Congress has been pretty consistent. While Europe is a little bit more afraid of intimidating Russia too much. Yes, next slide, please. So the vision, what is the vision, the EU vision of what the transatlantic relationship should be? Now I have outlined some of the issues where the EU and the US disagrees. And the vision you see here is in a speech given by head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She's Germany. She used to be the defense minister in Germany. And she's now heading the European Commission, which is one of the three main institutions in the EU. And I think this quote pretty much shows the prevalent view of European countries towards the United States at the moment. It's still the most valuable relationship that the EU has with another region, and there are so many common, not just shared values and history, but also present common interests. Where the EU and the US really differ is on this view on the international system. The fact that the EU prefers international organization, working things out multilaterally, while the US prefers to act and then maybe get others on board. Next slide, please. So if we can conclude anything on what I have just said, I would say that the last couple of years, the EU and the US have driven a little further apart. But there's also no question that the US continues to be the EU's closest ally in terms of economics, trade, and values. The hope in Europe is, no matter who wins the presidential elections in November, that limited trade agreements between the US and the EU and happen the next couple of years. There was a big trade agreement called TTIP that was negotiated during the Obama administration, but which has basically been in the deep freezer since. So there's a hope that you could maybe pull that out of the freezer and negotiate trade between the EU and the US. But there's also a sense that no matter who wins the next election, the US will be very focused on domestic politics. There is a polarized political environment in the US at the moment, and there's a little bit of fear in Europe that would make the US less interested in having sort of an active global role. It would be too consumed with own internal affairs. The decision makers on both sides of the Atlantic, they know that there's more at stake than just a good transatlantic relationship. They also know that if this relationship is not strong, it might de facto determine what the world will look like in the future. Because if the EU and the US don't cooperate, you will see China, Russia, and other powers try to fill the void or the vacuum left by this transatlantic relationship. Because neither the US nor the European Union alone are strong enough to sort of see their interest carried through. Next slide, please. So the question is, what is the future of the transatlantic relations going to look like? I touched upon it a little bit before. There's also no doubt that the EU will continue to be slow in taking decisions. It would have pretty muddled compromises sometimes, and it will still seek to get its interest through multilateral international organizations rather than go it alone. And the question is, if the US wants to be engaged more actively than it has been, the US has of course been active, but the US has been more active in stalling things than actually solve some of the issues that are there globally. At least that's the point of view in Europe, that you have, that the US has posed sanctions. And maybe you can say to a certain extent the US has been successful in having European states raise their defense budgets a little bit, but it hasn't solved any of the problems in the international trade, or it hasn't solved any of the political or military conflicts that we have seen globally. It will take two to tango if the future transatlantic relations should grow a little bit better. At least at the moment, you had foreign ministers meet this summer with Mike Pompeo, the secretary, and the French newspaper Le Monde described that meeting as a dialogue of the deaf. That the way that we, not that there are not common interests, but the solutions that are pointed to are just very different at the moment on both sides of the Atlantic. Some believe, though, that the outer pressure from states like China particularly, but also Russia, could force the US and Europe to work more together in the future, because otherwise it's very difficult to see that the liberal values and the common interests, after all, that are still there and that I have tried to point to in this little talk, would survive. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions. I know it was a little long, I'm sorry.
No, on the contrary, it's wonderful, wonderful. And we do have quite a few questions for you, actually. Let me get myself here together with my screen, And let's see how we can do this in an orderly way. So one of the first questions we had early on was, someone is very curious about how serious was the Brexit to the EU?
Brexit is very serious. It's a big member state that left the EU. It was, of course, also a state that had really good relationship with the United States. But in a way, even though the EU on the global stage becomes smaller, and that's not a good thing, it becomes smaller economically, it becomes smaller politically, it also means that the distance in opinion between member states is not as big anymore. So the situation now is, can Germany and France agree on something, then in some cases it would be easier to find a European common position than it was before.
Well,
Brexit is not good for Europe, and it's not. I don't think it's good for Britain either.
Another question is, has the Trump administration's trade policy affected the EU's stability?
It has not affected the EU stability in the sense that the EU is also pretty tough on trade. In the beginning of the administration, Trump did impose sanctions on steel and some other commodities, but it's an interdependent economic relationship. There's a lot of American investments in Europe and a lot of European investments in the United States. So the sanctions that Trump has imposed on Europe has not destabilized Europe, because it's been on very particular products, very particular sectors. And he has, of course, also done this to show back home that he's tough on Europe. And so, but I mean, particularly with Germany, it's been a problem because he's been threatening their car industry.
Very interesting. Yeah. So the questions are a little bit varied. Now we have a question asking, how important is NATO to the EU?
NATO is very important. There's not a complete overlap between the states that are members of NATO and the states that are members of the EU. So you have some countries that are not in both places. But through the 90s, you kind of had a division of labor where it was that NATO would take care of hardcore security, so would take care of the military part, while the EU would take care of some of the softer stuff like the defense industry and defense contracts and things like that. Nowadays, that has changed a little bit, and more European states are thinking about a European defense. But there's no common agreement on this in Europe, because you have countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, that simply don't believe that Europeans will ever be able to defend them if something happens. They rely on the United States to do it.
Very interesting. I have another question here. What is the EU stand on the Northern Ireland border disputes?
The EU is part of an agreement that of course the UK has also signed up to, and that has been part of the negotiations in Brexit to try not to have a physical border in Northern Ireland. So they want to maintain the free movement in Ireland.
Okay.
It's been very important. It's one of the big issues right now between Brussels and London, is to make sure there's no border in Northern Ireland.
Okay, well, very interestingly, well, this is a really charged question here. So as China's economy grows, is there fear that their currency could end up being the default currency on Earth?
Who knows what the world will bring? I don't, well, at the moment, it's still the US dollar, and I think the euro is still number 2. And that's because China hasn't opened its markets. China is not trading globally. I know there's a trade deficit with the United States, but really, China is not trading globally as much as the US and the EU at the moment. Of course, that might change, and it changes fast because China is growing so fast. I mean, what has happened there the past 20 years is unbelievable.
Sure has, it sure has. Well, Iben, I don't have any other questions, but I must say that this has been extremely interesting. One other comment here in general is that, of course, everyone has an extreme interest in this subject, and they want to know if you'd be willing to share your slides. And I'm not going to put you on the spot.
Absolutely.
You can share that information later with Ron Felton, our secretary. And if you're going to make those available, then we'll let the club know how how they can be available to everyone. But I'm sure that everyone will join me in thanking you for such
Thank you for
informative
having me.
presentation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, yes, I pass it on to our good president, Skip.
Iben, it has been a real pleasure having you. And I think, first of all, I know that you put a lot into the presentation, and I thank you for that. And of course, obviously, the knowledge that you have is really beneficial to all of us. I have one question for you, if you don't mind. We're going to go back to the Northern Ireland. I've traveled to Ireland many times in my life, and I remember crossing into Northern Ireland, and of course you had the checkpoints. And then in the last 20, 30 years, there's no difference between traveling from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland than going from Guanajuato and Querétaro. It's just, you just cross into it. If they go back to, if this doesn't work out, there's a possibility then, from what I hear you say, that they could reinstitute those checkpoints at the border. And if that were to happen, that possibly could lead to a return to the troubles that we are all familiar with from the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s.
Yes, and actually there the EU and the US has a common interest, because the US is also very focused on Ireland, of course, also because they helped broker the peace there. And that has put a lot of pressure on London, actually, because it's
oh yeah.
At the moment, it's the UK that wants to sort of leave the agreement they agreed to last year. So that's a problem. And right now there are intense negotiations going on. I don't believe you will have checkpoints to the same extent as we saw in history, but there will be checkpoints. It would mostly be on products and less on people. But it all depends on the negotiations that go on right now.
All right.
I don't think it will be as harsh as it was previously, but there is that scare.
Well, with all the movements going on throughout the world on nationalism, you kind of worry about things like that. So,
oh yes.
All right, Iben, I appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And
thank you for having me.
We hope to see you one of these days here in San Miguel de Allende.
I hope so too. I hope so. Traveling is very hard these days.
Right. A little bit of a challenge right now.
Yes.
All right, Ron Felton has a short announcement before we adjourn. Ron?
In follow-up to Nori's question about the slides being available, and since Iben has given us permission, I will convert those to a PDF. And if you go to our website and go to our weekly meeting section of the website, you will see a video of this presentation, and I will also make available attachment with those slides so anyone can have them.
Tom Schneider, could you talk to us a little bit about fundraising?
Yeah, I think we all know in this time of digital things that Rotary doesn't have access to the same fundraising vehicles as we do. I see a number of people that aren't normally here. I want to remind you that our website is and your way to click through is right on your invitation. When you click leave to this meeting, please go to the website. You can take a look at not only what has been talked about in the past, but also our projects and that. And there's that yellow donate button there. We used to get 50 to 200 pesos from a lot of the people who would visit our club, and a lot of people that would come to hear these fabulous speakers were able to. And we don't get that anymore. So please, whether you're in the United States or Mexico or another country, please just go through and give a click to that donate button. It's very easy with PayPal and all the credit cards you can do to make a contribution for Rotary's fine work all over Mexico. So click leave, then go to the website, which is, if you don't know it, is rotarysmamidday.org. But just click through on the buttons. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Very, very important, folks, that you do that, because right now, obviously, we're not being able to do a lot of the fundraising, as Tom had mentioned, that we've done in the past, particularly at our meetings where we used to do wine raffles and happy pesos. We're not doing that anymore. And our annual events like our Oktoberfest, where we generated a significant amount of money, we're trying to take care of things like eradicating polio and then provide money for a lot of the great work that Rotary does here in the greater San Miguel municipality. So for those of you that are members and those of you that are guests, please go to our website, hit the donate button, as Tom had mentioned, and give what you can. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. And more importantly, we really need it too. All right, a meeting of our membership committee immediately follows this meeting. I see by the old clock on the wall, we're right about on time, so this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.